On my son's 30th birthday, he looked me in the eye and said the cruelest words any parent could hear. "Instead of a gift, what I want is for you to disappear." So I did exactly what he asked. But what happened next turned his perfect life into a nightmare he never saw coming. Watch to find out how one birthday wish destroyed everything he thought he knew about loyalty and friendship. Guys, my old man is going to show up with some lame gift any minute now. Probably another lecture about responsibility or some vintage junk he thinks is meaningful. I heard Tyler's voice drifting up from the living room as I stood in my bedroom doorway, holding the small velvet box that contained my father's watch, the same one he'd worn through 40 years of construction work. The leather strap still carried the faint scent of sawdust and honest sweat, and I'd spent 3 weeks getting it repaired at the old jeweler's shop downtown. My son was turning 30 today, and despite everything between us, I believed this gift might finally bridge the gap. The house below buzzed with preparation sounds, caterers arranging tables, his friends arriving early to help set up what looked more like a corporate event than a birthday party. I tucked the watch box into my jacket pocket, feeling its weight against my chest like a stone. The living room had been transformed into something I barely recognized. Crystal glasses caught the afternoon light streaming through windows I'd installed myself 20 years ago, and expensive bottles of whiskey lined the marble countertop that Tyler had insisted on buying last month. With my money, of course. I counted at least 15 of his friends, all dressed in designer suits that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. The air hung thick with cologne, and the kind of forced camaraderie that comes from people trying too hard to prove they belong together. I watched from the kitchen doorway as Tyler moved through the crowd like a performer on stage, his laugh just a decibel too loud, his gestures just a fraction too animated. The way he touched everyone's shoulders, the way he insisted on refilling empty glasses before anyone asked. I'd seen this routine before. "There's the old man!" Tyler's voice cut through the conversation as he spotted me. His friends turned in unison, their smiles polite but hollow, the kind reserved for parents at adult gatherings. I nodded to each of them, recognizing faces from previous parties, previous celebrations where I'd played the same background role. David stepped forward first, tall, confident, with the kind of easy smile that had always made Tyler light up like a child. "Happy birthday to your son, Mr. Peterson," he said, extending his hand with practiced warmth. Behind him, I noticed 2 other young men exchanging glances, their eyes already glassy from whatever they'd been drinking. The expensive sound system pumped bass through the floorboards, vibrating up through my feet, and I wondered when exactly my quiet home had become this kind of place. I pulled the velvet box from my jacket pocket, feeling the worn edges against my fingers. "Tyler, I have something for you." My voice sounded smaller than I'd intended in the crowded room, competing with music and overlapping conversations. He turned toward me, but I could see his attention was divided. One eye on me, one eye on his friends who had started gathering closer, curiosity mixing with the kind of anticipation people have when they expect to be entertained. The box felt heavier somehow as I held it out to him, and I found myself remembering the day my own father had given me this same watch, his calloused hands trembling slightly as he explained that it had belonged to his father before him. "It's not much," I continued, my throat suddenly dry, "but it belonged to your grandfather and his father before that." Tyler took the box without looking at it, his eyes still scanning the room as if checking to make sure everyone was watching. When he finally opened it, I saw something flicker across his face, recognition, maybe even a moment of genuine emotion, before his expression hardened into something I'd seen too many times before. A watch? His voice carried that particular edge he used when he wanted his friends to know he was about to say something cutting. Dad, you know I have a Rolex, right? The group around us shifted uncomfortably, some looking down at their drinks, others watching with the morbid fascination people have for family arguments in public. I felt my chest tighten as I watched him hold up the watch, letting it dangle from the chain like it was something he'd found in a gutter. David stepped closer to Tyler, and I caught the subtle way he shook his head. Just a tiny movement that somehow encouraged what came next. You know what, Dad? Tyler's voice grew louder, more theatrical, as if he'd made a decision to turn this moment into performance art. Instead of a gift, what I really want is for you to disappear. The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, and I watched as his friends' faces registered shock, amusement, and something that might have been approval. My hands found the back of the nearest chair, gripping the wood until my knuckles went white, and I felt that familiar sensation I'd experienced so many times before. The feeling of watching my son transform into someone I didn't recognize. The watch fell to the floor with a soft thud that somehow cut through all the background noise, and I stared at it lying there on the carpet, its face cracked, the second hand still trying desperately to keep time. I mean it, Tyler continued, his voice gaining momentum now, fed by the attention of his audience. Every time you're around, you make everything awkward and weird. Time seemed to slow as I bent down to pick up the watch, my joints protesting as I knelt on the carpet where I'd spent countless evenings reading bedtime stories to this same man when he was small. The metal was cold against my palm, and through the cracked crystal, I could still see the inscription my father had engraved on the back. Time teaches us what matters most. Around me, the conversations had died completely, leaving only the relentless pulse of the music and the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. I straightened slowly, tucking the broken watch into my pocket, and looked at my son. Really looked at him, seeing past the expensive clothes and confident posture to something desperate and small underneath. His friends were watching us both now, some with phones already out, probably recording this moment for whatever social media platform they used to document their lives. I thought about all the times I'd covered his gambling debts, all the failed business ventures I'd quietly funded, all the nights I'd waited up wondering if he'd come home safe. All right, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. If that's what you want. I could see the surprise flash across Tyler's face. He'd expected an argument, maybe anger, certainly not this calm acceptance. Behind him, David's expression shifted to something that looked almost like concern, though whether for Tyler or for some plan I couldn't yet see, I wasn't sure. I moved toward the front door, feeling 30 pairs of eyes following my progress, and paused with my hand on the knob I'd oiled just last week. The house felt different already, like it was rejecting me, pushing me out into the world beyond these walls I'd spent decades maintaining. "Happy birthday, son," I said over my shoulder, not trusting myself to look back at his face. The last thing I heard before closing the door was the sound of someone turning the music up louder, as if they could drown out what had just happened between us. My hands moved automatically through 40 years of belongings, folding shirts that had seen countless birthdays, graduations, and holidays into the same leather suitcase I'd used for my honeymoon. The bedroom felt smaller somehow, as if the walls were closing in on memories I wasn't ready to abandon. Tyler's first steps across this very carpet, the night terrors that brought him running to this bed, the proud moment when he'd graduated college and promised to make me proud. I pulled open the dresser drawer where I kept important documents and found myself staring at a photo from his 8th birthday. Tyler grinning gap-toothed while hugging a baseball glove I'd saved 3 months to buy, his eyes bright with genuine joy and love. The contrast with the man downstairs, surrounded by his audience of enablers, felt like looking at 2 different people entirely. I slipped the photo into my shirt pocket, right next to the broken watch, and continued packing with the methodical precision of someone who had learned long ago that dwelling on pain only made it sharper. The drive to Robert's house took me through neighborhoods I'd helped build, past houses where I'd installed windows, repaired foundations, and fixed the kinds of problems that required patience and steady hands. Robert had been my law school roommate back when I'd still believed I could be a lawyer like him, before life redirected me toward construction work that paid the bills and supported a family. His practice specialized in family law, which meant he'd seen plenty of sons and daughters who confused loyalty with weakness, love with control. I pulled into his driveway just as the sun was setting, painting his modest 2-story house in shades of gold that reminded me of better times. Through his front window, I could see him at his desk, probably reviewing cases, his gray hair caught in the warm light of a banker's lamp that had belonged to his father. The sight of him working alone in that quiet room filled me with a longing I hadn't expected, for simplicity, for relationships that weren't transactional, for conversations that didn't end in shouting matches about responsibility and respect. Robert opened his door before I could knock, his weathered face creased with concern as he took in my suitcase and whatever expression I was wearing. "James," he said simply, stepping aside to let me in without questions or explanations. His living room smelled like old books and the jasmine tea his late wife had loved, and I found myself sinking into the same leather chair where we'd spent countless evenings discussing cases, family troubles, and the complicated mathematics of raising children who seemed determined to break your heart. He poured 2 glasses of bourbon without asking if I wanted one, the amber liquid catching the light from the fireplace where framed photos of his own children smiled down at us, successful, grateful children who called every week and visited every holiday. "Tyler?" he asked, settling into his chair with the kind of knowing look that comes from decades of friendship and professional experience with family dysfunction. I told him everything, starting with the watch and ending with the sound of music drowning out my departure, and Robert listened with the patience of someone who had heard similar stories from countless clients, but never from his oldest friend. When I finished, he swirled his bourbon thoughtfully, the ice clinking against the glass like a clock counting down the seconds of silence between us. "You know what I see in my practice, James?" His voice carried the weight of 40 years spent mediating between parents and children, husbands and wives, families torn apart by selfishness and pride. I see kids who never learned that actions have consequences because someone always stepped in to save them. He gestured toward a stack of case files on his desk, each one representing another family whose love had been twisted into something destructive. And I see parents who mistake enabling for affection, who think that saying no means they don't care enough. The words settled into my chest like stones, heavy with truth I'd been avoiding for years. Sometimes, letting go is the only way for a child to realize how weak he truly is, Robert continued, his eyes fixed on the fire that cast dancing shadows across the walls. Tyler has never had to stand on his own because you've always been there to catch him when he falls. I thought about all the times I'd paid his rent when his business ventures failed, all the credit card debts I'd quietly cleared, all the phone calls from creditors I'd handled while Tyler partied with friends who saw him as an endless source of entertainment funding. But what if he never learns? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, afraid of the answer but needing to hear it anyway. Robert's expression softened, with the kind of compassion that comes from watching too many families destroy themselves through misguided love. Then at least you'll know you tried everything, including the hardest thing of all, letting him face the truth about himself. Later that night, alone in Robert's guest room, I found myself opening the home security app on my phone with trembling fingers. The cameras I'd installed for safety now felt like windows into a world I no longer recognized, and what I saw made my stomach clench with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. Tyler had moved the party outside to the pool area, and the scene looked like something from a music video. Bodies everywhere, expensive bottles being passed around like water, and my carefully maintained yard littered with trash and broken glass. I watched him standing on the diving board, arms spread wide as his friends cheered him on, David right beside him, with that same encouraging smile that had been there when Tyler had told me to disappear. The pool lights cast everything in an unnatural blue glow that made the whole scene feel surreal, like watching a movie about strangers who happened to be using my house as their set. I switched between camera angles, documenting the destruction with the methodical attention to detail that construction work had taught me. The kitchen island was covered with spilled liquor and what looked like white powder arranged in neat lines, while someone had apparently tried to cook something and left the stove covered in grease and burned food. The living room furniture had been pushed against the walls to create a dance floor, and I could see red wine stains spreading across the carpet where Tyler had taken his first steps. Through the front window camera, I watched more cars arriving, strangers streaming into my home with the casual entitlement of people who had been told that someone else would handle the cleanup. Tyler moved through the crowd like a king holding court, his arm around David's shoulders as they posed for selfies against the backdrop of chaos they'd created together. What struck me most wasn't the destruction. Furniture could be replaced, carpets could be cleaned, but the way Tyler's face glowed with satisfaction as he surveyed his domain. This was the life he'd chosen, the family he'd selected over the one that had raised him, and he looked genuinely happy in a way I hadn't seen in years. David whispered something in his ear that made him laugh, and I watched my son's expression transform into something almost beautiful, the way it used to when I'd surprise him with ice cream or take him fishing. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Tyler wasn't performing anymore. This wasn't the artificial happiness he displayed during our strained conversations, or the defensive bravado he wore like armor when I questioned his choices. This was genuine joy, and it was being shared with everyone except the man who had sacrificed 40 years to make it possible. I closed the app and set the phone on Robert's nightstand, unable to watch anymore. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying the scent of rain that would wash clean the world, but leave the stains on my heart untouched. Tomorrow would bring consequences. Neighbors would complain, police might be called, and the bill for damages would eventually find its way to my mailbox. But tonight, my son was living exactly the life he wanted, surrounded by exactly the people he valued most, in exactly the world he'd chosen when he'd asked me to disappear. The broken watch ticked steadily in my shirt pocket, its damaged face still trying to mark time even as everything around it fell apart. Time teaches us what matters most, my father had engraved on the back, but I was beginning to wonder if some lessons could only be learned through loss. The first call came at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after I'd left Tyler's birthday party echoing in my ears. My phone buzzed against Robert's nightstand with the persistence of something urgent, and through the fog of half-sleep, I recognized Tyler's name on the screen like a ghost from a life I was trying to forget. I let it ring, watching the blue light pulse in the darkness of the guest room, each vibration like a heartbeat that gradually faded into silence. 5 minutes later, it started again, followed by another call, then another, creating a rhythm of desperation that I'd heard too many times before, always at ungodly hours, always with the same underlying panic, always followed by requests for money disguised as emergencies. Robert's house remained peaceful around me, filled with the kind of silence that comes from relationships built on mutual respect rather than financial dependency, and I forced myself to turn the phone face down and close my eyes. By morning, 12 missed calls and 17 text messages waited for me like breadcrumbs leading back to a forest I'd already escaped. Dad, I need to talk to you. Please call me back. It's important. Dad, seriously, I'm in trouble. The messages grew increasingly desperate as the night progressed, evolving from casual requests to barely contained panic, and I could almost hear Tyler's voice getting higher and tighter with each unanswered communication. Robert found me in his kitchen, staring at the phone screen over untouched coffee, and he didn't need to ask what was wrong. 40 years of friendship had taught him to read the particular brand of exhaustion that comes from loving someone who sees you as an ATM with legs. He's run out of money, I said, not looking up from the messages that painted a picture of consequences finally catching up with choices. The parties, the lifestyle, the friends who expect him to pick up every tab, it's finally caught up with him. The next call came while I was helping Robert repair a fence in his backyard. Honest work that reminded me of simpler times when problems could be solved with tools and sweat, rather than endless emotional negotiations. Tyler's ringtone cut through the afternoon quiet like a siren, and this time I answered, more out of curiosity than concern. Dad, thank God, his voice rushed through the speaker, breathless and strained in a way I'd never heard before. I need your help. I'm in serious trouble here. The background noise told its own story: traffic, urban chaos, the kind of public place where private conversations become desperate performances. What kind of trouble, Tyler? I asked, setting down the hammer and preparing myself for whatever elaborate explanation he'd constructed to justify his latest crisis. I owe some people money, okay? A lot of money, and they're not the kind of people who accept payment plans. The details spilled out like water through a broken dam. Gambling debts accumulated during late-night poker games with friends, investments in David's sure-thing business ventures that had evaporated like morning mist, and lifestyle expenses that had grown beyond any reasonable income. How much? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer would be a number designed to test the limits of parental love and financial responsibility. 50,000, Tyler whispered, the words barely audible over the sound of traffic and his own shame. But Dad, if I don't pay by Friday, they're going to... I hung up before he could finish the threat, my hands shaking not from fear, but from the realization that this conversation had been inevitable, since the moment I'd picked up his broken watch from the birthday party carpet. Robert looked at me over the fence post we'd been securing, his eyes filled with the kind of understanding that comes from watching countless families navigate similar crossroads. For 3 days, Tyler called every few hours, his messages growing more frantic and creative with each attempt. He tried anger first, accusations that I was abandoning him out of spite, that I was punishing him for speaking his mind at the party. Then came manipulation, stories about threats from dangerous people, and consequences that would follow him for years. Finally, he resorted to childhood memories, reminding me of fishing trips and baseball games and the promise I'd made to always be there for him. Each message felt like a carefully aimed arrow designed to find the soft spots in my resolve, and I found myself deleting them without listening to the ends, knowing that Tyler had learned exactly which emotional buttons to push from 30 years of successful manipulation. Robert watched me struggle with the kind of patience that comes from professional experience with family dynamics, offering silent support through shared meals and evening conversations that never mentioned the phone calls, but somehow acknowledged their weight. Thursday evening brought a different kind of call. Tyler's voice was calmer, more controlled, almost businesslike in its approach. Dad, I've figured it out. I don't need you to give me the money. Relief flooded through me until he continued. I just need you to co-sign on a loan. That way you're not actually paying anything, and I can handle this myself. The sophistication of the manipulation caught me off guard. He'd clearly spent time crafting this approach, probably with input from David or another friend who understood the psychology of financial pressure. Tyler, no, I said simply, my voice steady despite the earthquake of emotions beneath the surface. This is your problem, and you need to solve it yourself. The silence that followed felt like the moment before a storm breaks, filled with potential energy waiting to transform into something destructive. Fine, he said finally, his voice cold in a way that reminded me of his mother during our worst arguments. I'll figure it out myself, but don't expect me to forget this. The call from Detective Sarah Morrison came on a Friday morning while I was helping Robert prepare for a custody hearing, the kind of case that reminded us both how quickly families could fracture under pressure. Mr. Peterson, this is Detective Morrison with the Metro Police Department. I'm calling about your son, Tyler. The words hit me like a physical blow, and I found myself gripping Robert's desk chair to keep from falling as my knees suddenly refused to support my weight. There's been an incident, she continued, her voice professional but not unkind. Tyler has been arrested in connection with a series of commercial burglaries in the downtown area. We need you to come to the station for questioning. The room seemed to tilt sideways as the implications crashed over me. My son, the boy I'd taught to tie his shoes and ride a bicycle, had crossed a line that I'd never imagined he'd approach. The drive to the police station passed in a blur of traffic lights and half-formed prayers, with Robert insisting on driving because my hands shook too badly to grip the steering wheel properly. Detective Morrison met us in a sterile waiting room that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams, her badge catching the fluorescent light as she explained the charges with the methodical precision of someone who delivered this kind of news regularly. 3 electronics stores, 2 jewelry shops, and a luxury watch retailer, she said, consulting her notes with practiced efficiency. The security footage is quite clear, and we recovered several stolen items from his apartment, along with evidence linking him to a network of buyers for high-end merchandise. Each word felt like a nail being driven into a coffin I'd been building for years without realizing it, and I found myself thinking about all the warning signs I'd ignored, all the red flags I'd rationalized away as phases or growing pains. The thing is, Mr. Peterson, Detective Morrison continued, her voice softening slightly as she recognized the shock on my face. Tyler keeps asking for his friend David. Says David can vouch for his whereabouts during some of the incidents. Problem is, when we contacted David Miller, he claims he barely knows your son. Says they were casual acquaintances at best, and he has no knowledge of Tyler's activities. The words hit me like a second blow, harder than the first because they confirmed something I'd suspected, but hoped wasn't true. Tyler's entire world, the friends he'd valued above family, the relationships he'd chosen over the man who'd raised him, were as fragile as spiderwebs in a hurricane. Where is he now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, afraid of the answer, but needing to know anyway. Downtown holding, waiting for his arraignment, she replied, closing her folder with the finality of a book ending badly. He's been asking for you. Outside the police station, the afternoon sun felt impossibly bright, as if the world had no right to continue being beautiful, while my son sat in a cell designed for people whose lives had taken wrong turns they couldn't navigate back from. Robert placed a hand on my shoulder, with the kind of solid comfort that only decades of friendship can provide. But even his presence couldn't fill the hollow space that had opened in my chest. Tyler had chosen his path when he'd told me to disappear, when he'd valued the applause of fair-weather friends over the steady love of the man who'd never abandoned him. Now those same friends had evaporated like morning dew, leaving him alone with consequences that no amount of charm or manipulation could erase. The broken watch in my pocket had stopped ticking entirely, its damaged mechanism finally surrendering to the inevitable, and I wondered if some things, once broken, were simply meant to stay that way. The holding area smelled like industrial disinfectant mixed with desperation, a combination that seemed to seep into my clothes and settle in my lungs as Detective Morrison led me through a maze of corridors lined with reinforced glass and steel doors. My footsteps echoed against polished concrete floors that had been designed to withstand everything from blood to tears, and I found myself counting each step as a way to avoid thinking about what I would see when we reached our destination. Robert had offered to come with me, but this felt like something I needed to face alone. A final conversation with the son I'd raised, in a place where the consequences of his choices had finally caught up with both of us. Through small windows in passing doors, I caught glimpses of other families navigating similar tragedies. A mother crying into a tissue, while a lawyer explained plea bargains, a father arguing with a public defender about bail amounts, a grandmother holding car keys she'd used as collateral for bond money she couldn't afford. Detective Morrison paused outside a door marked Interview Room C, her hand resting on the handle as she studied my face with the practiced assessment of someone who had learned to predict how these encounters would unfold. Mr. Peterson, before we go in, I want you to know that your son has been difficult since his arrest. He's angry, he's scared, and he's looking for someone to blame. Her words carried the weight of professional experience with family dynamics under extreme stress, and I found myself nodding even though I wasn't sure I understood what she was preparing me for. He's demanding bail money and legal representation, and he's not taking no for an answer well. The hallway seemed to grow colder as the implications settled into my consciousness, and I realized that Tyler was about to discover that his safety net had finally developed holes too large to ignore. The door opened with a mechanical click that seemed louder than it should have been, revealing a small room dominated by a metal table and two plastic chairs that had been bolted to the floor. Tyler sat with his back to the entrance, his shoulders rigid beneath an orange jumpsuit that transformed him into someone I barely recognized. Not the confident young man who had demanded I disappear from his birthday party, but something smaller and more desperate, like a cornered animal waiting for rescue. When he heard the door, he spun around with an expression that immediately shifted from hope to rage when he saw my face. "Old man, get me out of this damn place." The words exploded from him with the force of suppressed panic, his voice echoing off the walls with a rawness that made me flinch. His face was flushed red with fury, and spit flew from his mouth as he shouted, transforming my son into someone who looked capable of violence. Before I could respond, Tyler's fist slammed against the metal table with a sound like a gunshot, the impact so violent that both chairs jumped, and the sound reverberated through the small space like thunder. "Did you hear me?" he screamed, his voice climbing to a pitch that suggested hysteria was lurking just beneath the surface. "I said get me out of here. Call your lawyer friend, write a check, do whatever you have to do, but I am not staying in this place." His hands were shaking as he gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white with the strain of containing whatever rage was building inside him. I could see a vein pulsing in his forehead, and his breathing had become rapid and shallow, like someone on the verge of a panic attack who was trying to control it through sheer force of will. I took the chair across from him slowly, my movements deliberate and calm in contrast to his explosive energy, and folded my hands on the table between us with the patience I'd learned from 40 years of dealing with his tantrums. "Tyler, we need to talk about—" "No!" he interrupted, his voice rising to a roar that probably carried through the entire building. "We don't need to talk about anything. You need to get me a lawyer and pay my bail and fix this mess like you always do." His face had turned an alarming shade of purple, and I could see the tendons in his neck standing out like cables under tension. "That's what fathers do for their sons. That's your job!" The words came out in a spray of saliva and fury, and I realized I was witnessing a complete breakdown of whatever self-control he'd managed to maintain since his arrest. Tyler stood abruptly, the plastic chair scraping against concrete as he began pacing the small space like a wild animal, his movements sharp and erratic. "Do you have any idea what this place is like?" he demanded, whirling to face me with eyes that looked dangerously close to madness. "Do you know what happens to people like me in here? I don't belong with these criminals and psychos. I made one mistake, and you're acting like I'm some kind of monster." His voice cracked on the last word, revealing the scared child underneath the adult who had made such a spectacular mess of his privileges. But instead of inspiring sympathy, the vulnerability only seemed to fuel his rage, as if showing weakness was another crime he needed to punish someone for witnessing. "This isn't about punishment, Tyler," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the earthquake of emotions beneath the surface. "This is about consequences. About learning that actions—" "Shut up!" he screamed, cutting me off with a volume that made my ears ring. "Don't give me your philosophical bullshit about consequences. I need action, not lectures." He slammed both palms against the table simultaneously, the double impact creating a sound like breaking bones. "You sat there at my birthday party looking all sad and pathetic when I told you to disappear. But here I am actually needing you for once, and you're just sitting there like a useless old man." The words hit me like physical blows, each syllable designed to inflict maximum damage, to find the soft spots in my resolve and exploit them mercilessly. I remained seated, watching him wear a path in the linoleum between the table and the far wall, and felt something cold and final settle in my chest like winter fog. His rage was spectacular and exhausting, a performance designed to overwhelm opposition through sheer volume and intensity. But underneath the fury, I could see the same manipulation tactics he'd used since childhood, escalating emotion until someone gave him what he wanted just to make the noise stop. "Tyler, sit down," I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd used when he was small and needed to be protected from his own poor judgment. "Screaming isn't going to change anything." The words only seemed to enrage him further, and he whirled toward me with his face twisted into something I barely recognized as human. "Don't tell me to sit down," he bellowed, spit flying from his mouth as he leaned across the table toward me. "Don't tell me to calm down. Don't tell me anything except when I'm getting out of here." His hands were clenched into fists now, and I could see him fighting the urge to hit something other than the table. Maybe the wall, maybe the chair, maybe me. "You know what your problem is, old man. You never understood that some people are meant for better things than this." He gestured wildly around the room, his movements becoming increasingly uncontrolled. "I had a life out there. I had friends, opportunities, a future. And now it's all ruined because you couldn't just write one check and make this go away." The irony of his words wasn't lost on me. The same person who had publicly wished for my disappearance was now demanding that I sacrifice everything to save him from the consequences of choices he'd made without consulting me. "Being my son means you were raised to know right from wrong," I said quietly, meeting his wild gaze with steady calm. "It means you had every advantage, every opportunity to make better choices than this." But Tyler was beyond hearing reason, beyond accepting responsibility, beyond everything except the desperate need to make this someone else's fault, someone else's problem to solve. "I hate you!" he screamed, the words echoing off the walls with such violence that I half expected the reinforced glass in the door to crack. I hate your lectures. I hate your disappointment. I hate the way you sit there judging me like you're so much better than everyone else." His whole body was shaking now with the force of his rage, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the room. "You want to know the truth? David was right. You are holding me back. You've always held me back with your small-minded thinking and your pathetic little construction worker mentality." The mention of David's name sent a chill through me, but before I could respond, Tyler was already launching into another explosion of fury that seemed to feed on itself like a wildfire. The silence that followed his latest outburst stretched between us like a chasm that couldn't be bridged by good intentions or parental love, and I could see Tyler beginning to realize that his tantrum wasn't producing the desired results. His shoulders slumped slightly, and for just a moment I glimpsed the exhaustion beneath the rage, the bone-deep weariness that comes from maintaining such intense emotion without achieving anything except sore vocal cords and bruised hands. But then Detective Morrison knocked on the door, her face visible through the reinforced glass, and Tyler's expression shifted to something desperate and calculating that made my blood run cold. 3 weeks had passed since his arrest, and this was my 7th visit to a son who greeted me each time with the same explosive hatred he'd displayed in the police station. The orange jumpsuit hung loose on his frame. He'd lost weight in detention, and dark circles under his eyes suggested that sleep came rarely in a place where every night brought the sounds of other men's nightmares. Tyler picked up the black phone receiver with hands that trembled slightly, and I noticed that his fingernails were bitten down to the quick, a nervous habit from childhood that had returned like an old scar reopening under pressure. Before I could even say hello, his voice exploded through the phone connection with the familiar venom I'd come to expect. "You miserable old bastard!" he screamed, loud enough that other visitors turned to stare at our table with the morbid fascination people have for public meltdowns. 3 weeks I've been rotting in this hellhole while you sit in your comfortable house pretending to be some kind of moral hero." His face was already flushed red with rage, and I could see the vein in his forehead starting to pulse with the rhythm of his accelerated heartbeat. I held the phone away from my ear as his voice climbed to a pitch that made the receiver vibrate in my hand, waiting for the initial wave of fury to exhaust itself before attempting any kind of response. Every night, I lie awake on that concrete slab they call a bed, listening to psychos and drug addicts talk about their crimes, and I think about how my own father abandoned me here like a piece of garbage. Tyler's words came out in a spray of saliva that fogged his side of the plexiglass, and I watched him pace back and forth in the small space beside his chair like a caged animal. "You know what the other inmates call me? Rich boy, pretty boy. They think it's funny that Daddy won't pay to get his precious son out of jail." His laugh was harsh and bitter, echoing through the phone with the kind of edge that develops when someone realizes their world has collapsed and they're still falling. "Tyler, if you'd just listen," I began, but he cut me off with a roar that made several guards look in our direction with professional interest. "No, I'm done listening to your sanctimonious bullshit about consequences and responsibility." He slammed his fist against the metal table on his side, the impact reverberating through the connection between us. "I need action, not philosophy. I need you to get me the hell out of here before these animals decide I'm an easy target." His eyes darted around the visiting room as if he expected to be attacked at any moment, and I realized that his rage might be masking genuine fear about his safety in a place where 30-year-old trust fund kids weren't exactly common. Week after week, I endured the same performance: Tyler's explosive anger, his demands for immediate rescue, his complete refusal to engage in any conversation that didn't revolve around his bail and release date. He cursed me with creativity that would have been impressive if it weren't so heartbreaking, calling me everything from a pathetic failure of a father to a selfish old man who gets off on watching his son suffer. Each visit followed the same script. Tyler would vent his rage for 20 minutes. I would attempt to inject some reason into the conversation, and he would respond with escalating fury until the guards ended our time together. But what struck me most during these weekly encounters wasn't his anger. It was the complete absence of anyone else in his life. The visiting log beside Tyler's name remained stubbornly short, containing only my signature repeated week after week in lonely isolation. No David, no Marcus, no Jackson or Brad, or any of the other names I'd heard him mention countless times over the years as his brothers and closest friends. The men who had filled his birthday party, who had cheered him on as he publicly humiliated his father, who had participated in the destruction of my home, none of them had found time in their busy schedules to spend 30 minutes talking to him through reinforced glass. "Where are all your friends, Tyler?" I asked, and his response was immediate and volcanic. "They're handling business," he screamed, his face turning purple with the effort of projecting enough volume to drown out uncomfortable questions. "They're working behind the scenes, making connections, setting up meetings with lawyers who actually know what they're doing." Tyler's hands clenched into fists as he spoke, and I could see him fighting the urge to punch something more substantial than the table. "You think friendship means sitting in some depressing room talking on phones? Real friends take action. They solve problems instead of just talking about them." But even as he spoke, I could see doubt creeping into his eyes like shadows at sunset, the kind of uncertainty that develops when explanations start requiring more effort than the situations they're meant to explain. Tyler's defenses had begun showing cracks that no amount of shouting could completely seal. "Maybe they don't know how to reach me," he said, during a brief lull in his usual tirade, his voice carrying a note of desperation that made him sound younger and more vulnerable. "The phone system here is complicated, and visitor registration takes time. David's probably working with his lawyer contacts right now, putting together a defense strategy that requires discretion." He was talking faster now, the words tumbling out like water from a broken dam, each explanation more elaborate than the last. "You have to understand, these guys have reputations to protect, businesses to run. They can't just drop everything and come running the moment something goes wrong." "David," I said quietly, and the effect was immediate and devastating. Tyler's phone clattered to the table as he stood so abruptly that his plastic chair toppled backward, hitting the floor with a crack that made every head in the visiting room turn toward us. "Don't you dare!" he screamed, his voice raw from weeks of similar outbursts, but somehow finding new reserves of fury. "Don't you dare bring David into this! You don't know anything about David, about what we've been through together!" His whole body was shaking with rage, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the room. Guards were moving toward us now, their hands resting casually on equipment that could end our visit in seconds, but Tyler seemed oblivious to everything except his need to defend the friendship that had defined his adult life. "Tyler, calm down and pick up the phone," I said, as guards flanked our table, their presence a reminder that even family conversations had limits in a place designed for people who had lost the privilege of unlimited emotional expression. Tyler grabbed the phone with hands that shook so badly he could barely maintain his grip, his breathing rapid and shallow like someone on the verge of hyperventilation. "David Miller has been my best friend since high school," he said, his voice cracking with emotion that transformed his face into something younger and more desperate. "He's the only person who ever really understood me, who saw past all the bullshit and appreciated who I really am underneath." The words poured out of him like a confession, revealing depths of dependency that even I hadn't fully understood. "When those guys were beating me up senior year, calling me spoiled and worthless, David was the one who stepped in," Tyler continued, his eyes bright with unshed tears that made him look like the frightened teenager he'd once been. "He got suspended defending my honor, Risked his own reputation to protect mine when nobody else gave a damn. The memory seemed to unlock something in him, and suddenly he was 12 years old again, desperately trying to convince me that his latest friend was different from all the others who had disappointed him. David let me live in his apartment after college when I couldn't find work. Never once made me feel like a burden or a failure. He introduced me to people, vouched for me with his own credibility, treated me like the brother I always wanted to be. Tyler's voice grew stronger as he recounted years of shared experiences, painting pictures of a friendship that had sustained him through his darkest moments and biggest failures. We've been through everything together. Breakups, job losses, family problems, financial disasters. David was there for all of it, never judging, never abandoning me when things got tough. His face glowed with the kind of warmth I hadn't seen since he was small, and I realized I was watching him relive the golden age of a relationship that had filled spaces in his heart that I'd never even known were empty. He calls me his chosen family, says that blood doesn't matter compared to loyalty and shared history. We've got inside jokes that go back 15 years, traditions that nobody else understands, a whole language that developed from years of being in each other's lives. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the background noise of other conversations and the hum of fluorescent lights that seemed to grow louder as Tyler's memories collided with present reality. His grip on the phone had relaxed, and I watched him sink back into his chair as if the weight of his own words had become too much to carry while standing. "So, where is he, Tyler?" I asked quietly, my voice barely above a whisper, but somehow cutting through all the ambient noise like a blade. "If David is everything you say he is, if he's really your chosen family, your brother, your closest friend, where has he been for the past 3 weeks?" The question hung between us like smoke from a house fire, and I watched my son's face as the implications began to register in real time. Tyler's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound, and I could see him scrolling through possible explanations with the desperate speed of someone looking for answers that simply didn't exist. He's probably... Tyler's voice trailed off as whatever excuse he was constructing collapsed under the weight of 3 weeks' worth of evidence. His breathing became rapid and shallow again, but this time the panic wasn't fueled by rage. It was the raw terror of someone realizing that their most fundamental beliefs about human nature might be wrong. The phone receiver trembled in his hands as he stared at me through the plexiglass, and I could see something breaking behind his eyes, some essential faith in the world crumbling like a building with a flawed foundation. "But he promised," Tyler whispered, so quietly I had to press the receiver closer to my ear to hear him. "He said brotherhood was forever, that we'd always have each other's backs no matter what happened." The words carried so much pain that I found myself wishing I could reach through the glass to offer some kind of physical comfort, even though I knew that the distance between us was about more than reinforced barriers and institutional security. Tyler's face had gone pale, and his eyes held the kind of hollow look that comes from staring into an abyss that used to be filled with certainty and trust. What Tyler is about to discover will shatter everything he believed about loyalty and friendship. But the truth about David is far worse than simple abandonment. Keep watching to learn the shocking secret that will change this story forever. The phone receiver felt impossibly heavy in my hand as I watched Tyler struggle with the dawning realization that his best friend hadn't contacted him in 3 weeks. His face had gone pale beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, and his breathing had become shallow and rapid, like someone trying to process information that didn't fit into any framework their mind could accept. I could see him constructing and discarding explanations in real time, each theory more desperate than the last, until finally his eyes met mine through the reinforced plexiglass with the kind of vulnerable confusion I hadn't seen since he was a child, asking why other kids didn't want to play with him. "Dad," he whispered, his voice so quiet I had to press the phone closer to my ear. "There has to be an explanation. David he wouldn't abandon me like this." The pain in his voice was so raw that I found myself hesitating, knowing that what I was about to tell him would shatter something fundamental about how he understood human relationships, loyalty, and trust. Tyler had built his entire adult identity around the belief that his friends were his real family, that the bonds he'd chosen were stronger and more meaningful than the biological connections he'd inherited. "Tyler," I said gently, my voice carrying all the compassion I could manage while still delivering information that would cut him like broken glass. "There's something else about David that you need to know. Something the police told me when they first called about your arrest." His grip tightened on the phone receiver, and I could see his knuckles going white as he prepared himself for whatever revelation was coming. "It was David who called the police about your activities," I said, the words falling between us like stones into still water, creating ripples that would eventually reach every shore of Tyler's understanding. "Detective Morrison told me that they'd been watching you for weeks, but they didn't have enough evidence to make arrests until someone who knew your patterns, your schedule, your habits, gave them detailed information about when and where to find you." Tyler's mouth fell open, but no sound emerged, as if the information was so incomprehensible that his brain had temporarily forgotten how to process language. I watched him shake his head slowly, mechanically, like someone trying to physically dislodge thoughts that refused to make sense. "That's not possible," Tyler said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying the weight of 15 years of friendship and trust. "David doesn't even know about... He never..." Tyler's words trailed off as memories began reassembling themselves in his mind, past conversations and interactions suddenly taking on new meanings when viewed through the lens of betrayal. "But he was at my birthday party. He was laughing with everyone, drinking my alcohol, eating my food. He shook your hand, called you Mr. Peterson like he always does." The desperation in his voice was painful to hear, like listening to someone try to sing a song they'd forgotten the words to, filling in the blanks with hope and denial rather than accepting the silence. I leaned forward until my forehead almost touched the plexiglass, trying to bridge the physical distance between us with proximity and gentleness. "Think about the birthday party, Tyler. Think about the moment when I gave you the watch." I watched his face as he scrolled through the memory, his expression shifting from confusion to concentration to something approaching horror as details began to click into place like puzzle pieces forming a picture he didn't want to see. "David was standing right beside you when you told me to disappear. Do you remember what he did right before you said those words?" Tyler's breathing became rapid and shallow as the memory sharpened, and I could see him reliving that moment with the terrible clarity that comes from understanding manipulation after it's already succeeded. He shook his head. Tyler whispered, the words coming out like a confession of something shameful. "Just a little movement, almost like he was disappointed in me for not being cruel enough on my own." Tyler's hands were trembling now as he gripped the phone, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the visiting room. "But that doesn't mean... It could have been coincidence, or maybe he was just reacting to the situation, or..." His voice trailed off as more memories began to surface, each one adding weight to a conclusion he desperately didn't want to reach. "Oh God," he breathed, his face going even paler as something else occurred to him. "The parties, the expensive alcohol, the drugs, the people I didn't really know who kept showing up. David was always the one encouraging me to go bigger, spend more, invite more people. I watched my son's worldview crumble in real time as 15 years of friendship recontextualized itself as manipulation, grooming, and betrayal. Tyler's entire body was shaking now, not with rage, but with the kind of shock that comes from discovering that your most fundamental beliefs about human nature have been wrong. "He knew I'd stolen those things," Tyler said, his voice hollow and distant, like someone speaking from the bottom of a deep well. "I told him about the electronics stores, the jewelry shops, the watch place. I told him because I thought he was my brother, my family, someone I could trust with anything." His laugh was bitter and broken, echoing through the phone connection with the sound of dreams dying. "Tyler," I said softly, trying to anchor him to something real and present as his psychological foundations collapsed around him. "David was never your friend. Friends don't encourage self-destructive behavior. Friends don't manipulate you into destroying relationships with your family. Friends don't gather evidence against you and then disappear when you need them most." Each word seemed to hit him like a physical blow, and I watched him flinch with every syllable as the full scope of David's betrayal became clear. "He used you, son. He used your loneliness, your need for acceptance, your desire to be seen as successful and generous. He turned all of your best impulses against you until you were isolated from everyone who actually cared about your well-being." His grip on the phone receiver had loosened, and I could see him staring at nothing, his eyes unfocused as he traveled through memories that had suddenly become evidence of his own victimization rather than proof of his social success. "All those times he encouraged me to argue with you," Tyler said slowly, his voice carrying the wondering tone of someone making connections they'd never noticed before. "All those parties where he'd make jokes about family being overrated, about how blood relatives just hold you back from your real potential. He was isolating you," I confirmed gently, my heart breaking, as I watched my son finally understand the systematic way his trust had been weaponized against him. Classic manipulation tactics: make you dependent on the group for validation, then gradually separate you from anyone who might provide alternative perspectives or genuine support. Tyler's face crumpled as the implications continued to unfold, and I could see him remembering countless incidents where David had subtly undermined his relationship with me, his mother before she died, even other friends who might have provided healthier influences. The business ventures that failed, the investments that disappeared, the gambling debts that kept growing. David was always there encouraging you to take bigger risks, spend more money, trust people who were obviously taking advantage of your generosity. Tyler's shoulders began to shake as something deeper than anger or fear took hold of him. The kind of grief that comes from mourning not just a relationship, but an entire version of yourself that turns out to have been built on lies. "I defended him to you," Tyler whispered, his voice breaking on every word. "I chose him over you, over and over again. I believed him when he said you didn't understand me, that you were holding me back, that real family was about choice rather than obligation." Tears were streaming down his face now, and I could see the little boy I'd raised trying to emerge from underneath 30 years of misguided pride and manufactured independence. "I told you to disappear on my birthday because I thought David and the others were my real family, the people who actually valued me for who I was." The phone receiver slipped from Tyler's trembling hands and clattered against the metal table, the sound echoing through the visiting room like a gunshot. I watched my son bury his face in his hands as 15 years of friendship revealed itself as systematic emotional abuse, manipulation designed to extract maximum value while providing minimum genuine support. His whole body was convulsing with sobs now, the kind of deep, wrenching grief that comes from discovering that your most cherished beliefs about yourself and the world have been carefully constructed illusions. Guards were looking in our direction with professional concern, but I gestured for them to wait, knowing that Tyler needed this breakdown, needed to process the complete destruction of his false reality before he could begin building something real. When Tyler finally looked up, his face was streaked with tears and snot, but his eyes held a clarity I hadn't seen in years. The clarity that comes from stripping away comfortable lies and facing uncomfortable truth. "Dad," he said, his voice raw from crying, but somehow stronger than it had been in months. "You're the only one who kept coming. Week after week, visit after visit, even when I screamed at you, cursed you, blamed you for everything that went wrong in my life." He picked up the phone receiver with hands that still shook, but no longer from rage or denial. "You're the only one who never abandoned me, never used me, never disappeared when loving me became inconvenient or expensive or socially awkward." I felt my own eyes begin to water as I watched my son finally see me clearly for the first time in decades. But before I could respond, Tyler's expression suddenly shifted to something approaching panic. "Dad," he said urgently, his voice carrying a new kind of fear that made my blood run cold. "If David was feeding information to the police for weeks, if he was documenting my activities and reporting my movements—" Tyler's face went pale as a new realization hit him. What else does he know? What else has he been planning? The drive back to Robert's house passed in a blur of traffic lights and half-formed thoughts, my mind still processing the image of Tyler's tear-streaked face as he finally understood the scope of David's betrayal. My hands gripped the steering wheel with the kind of white-knuckled intensity that comes from trying to maintain control when everything inside you wants to break apart, and I found myself taking deep breaths that tasted like the stale air of the jail visiting room. Robert was waiting on his front porch when I pulled into the driveway, his weathered face creased with the kind of concern that comes from decades of friendship and professional experience with family crises. He didn't ask how the visit had gone. The expression on my face apparently told him everything he needed to know about conversations that end with sons finally seeing their fathers clearly for the first time in years. "He knows about David," I said, as I sank into the familiar leather chair in Robert's living room. The same chair where I'd spent countless evenings over the past month discussing Tyler's situation and the complicated mathematics of parental love versus enabling destructive behavior. He finally understands that his best friend, his chosen brother, the person he valued more than his own family, was the one who destroyed his life. The words felt heavy in my mouth, like stones I'd been carrying for too long and was finally able to set down. Robert poured 2 glasses of bourbon without being asked, the amber liquid catching the light from the fireplace where photographs of his successful, grateful children smiled down at us like reminders that families could actually work the way they were supposed to. "How did he take it?" Robert asked, settling into his chair with the practiced movements of someone who had spent years listening to other people's worst moments and helping them navigate toward something resembling resolution. His voice carried the professional gentleness that had made him successful in family law, the ability to discuss devastating revelations with the same calm attention he might give to reviewing a contract. I took a sip of bourbon and felt it burn its way down my throat, a welcome distraction from the memory of Tyler's complete breakdown, the way his shoulders had shaken as 15 years of carefully constructed beliefs crumbled around him like a house built on sand. "Like someone discovering that gravity doesn't work the way they thought it did," I replied, watching the fire dance in the grate and remembering how Tyler's face had looked when he realized that every major decision he'd made as an adult had been influenced by someone who was systematically betraying him. Complete disorientation, followed by the kind of grief you feel when someone dies. Except in this case, It was his entire understanding of friendship, loyalty, and trust that died. Robert nodded with the knowing expression of someone who had seen countless clients go through similar revelations. The moment when victims of manipulation finally understand how thoroughly they've been used, how completely their reality has been constructed by people who didn't have their best interests at heart. "So what happens now?" Robert asked, his question carrying the weight of professional and personal interest in my son's future and my own decision-making process. "Tyler needs legal representation, regardless of how he got into this situation or who betrayed him along the way. The charges are serious, and without proper counsel, he's looking at significant prison time." I knew Robert was right. Theft charges, especially multiple counts involving high-value merchandise, carried penalties that could destroy whatever chance Tyler had of rebuilding his life after this catastrophe. "I've been thinking about that," I said slowly, turning the bourbon glass in my hands and feeling the weight of a decision that would define our relationship for whatever years we had left together. "I want you to represent him," I said, meeting Robert's eyes across the small table that held our glasses and the accumulated wisdom of decades of friendship. "I want you to give him the best defense possible, to fight for every legal advantage, to treat his case like it was your own son sitting in that jail cell." Robert's expression shifted slightly, and I could see him processing the implications of what I was asking. Not just professional representation, but the kind of personal investment that comes from 40 years of trust and shared history. "But," I continued, holding up my hand to forestall his response, "I also want you to make sure he understands that this is a gift, not an expectation. That this is me choosing to help him despite everything he's done, not because I owe him anything or because he's managed to manipulate me into compliance." Robert was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with the careful attention he brought to difficult cases where the stakes involved more than money or property. "You're walking a very fine line, James," he said finally, his voice carrying the cautious tone he used when clients were making decisions that could backfire spectacularly. "On one hand, you're providing him with resources that could literally save his future. On the other hand, you're trying to maintain boundaries that force him to take responsibility for his choices." I nodded, knowing that Robert understood the complexity of what I was attempting: to show love without enabling, to provide support without removing consequences, to offer help while still requiring growth. "The difference is that this time he'll know exactly what he's receiving and why," I explained, leaning forward in my chair and feeling the weight of months of careful consideration behind every word. "For 30 years, I've been cleaning up his messes quietly, paying his debts without discussion, solving his problems behind the scenes so he never had to face the full cost of his decisions." I thought about all the credit card statements I'd paid, all the failed business ventures I'd funded, all the times I'd made Tyler's problems disappear without him ever having to acknowledge the sacrifice involved. This time, he'll know that I'm choosing to help him despite having every reason to walk away, despite being the person he publicly humiliated and privately despised for years. Robert swirled his bourbon thoughtfully, the ice clinking against the glass like a clock counting down the moments before decisions become irreversible. "And after I represent him, after we get him the best possible outcome given the circumstances, what then?" His question cut to the heart of what I'd been wrestling with since Tyler's breakdown in the visiting room, the moment when my son finally saw me clearly for the first time in decades. "Then I disappear," I said quietly, the words carrying a finality that surprised even me with its completeness. Not out of anger or revenge or spite, but because that's what he asked for. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is give someone exactly what they think they want. The silence that followed stretched between us like a bridge spanning the gap between intention and action, and I could see Robert working through the implications of what I was proposing. "You're talking about cutting contact with your only child," he said carefully, his voice carrying the professional concern of someone who had seen too many families destroyed by decisions made in moments of emotional extremity. That's not something you can easily undo if you change your mind. And it's not something he can easily repair if he realizes he made a mistake. I knew Robert was right about the permanence of what I was considering. But I also knew that Tyler needed to learn lessons that could only be taught through genuine consequences, real loss, actual absence of the safety net that had always appeared whenever his life became genuinely difficult. "Robert," I said, standing and walking to the window that looked out onto his carefully maintained garden, where everything grew according to natural laws rather than artificial support systems. Tyler is 30 years old, and he's never faced a single major consequence without someone stepping in to minimize the damage. He's never had to rebuild a relationship he'd destroyed, never had to earn back trust he'd violated, never had to live with the genuine cost of choosing cruelty over kindness. I turned back to face my oldest friend, knowing that what I was about to say would sound harsh to anyone who hadn't spent 3 decades watching someone they loved make the same destructive choices over and over again. Maybe it's time he learned what loss actually feels like, so he can understand what love actually means. 3 days later, I found myself back in the county jail visiting room, sitting across from Tyler in the same plastic chair where I'd watched his worldview collapse and rebuild itself around uncomfortable truths about friendship, loyalty, and manipulation. He looked different now, not just physically, though the weight loss and exhaustion were obvious, but something fundamental in his posture, his expression, the way he held himself, had changed. "Dad," he said as soon as he picked up the phone, his voice carrying a humility I'd never heard before. "I've been thinking about everything you told me about David, about how blind I was to what was really happening." His words came out slowly, carefully, like someone testing each syllable for truthfulness before releasing it into the world. "I've arranged for Robert to represent you," I said without preamble, watching Tyler's face as he processed this information. "He's one of the best criminal defense attorneys in the state, and he's agreed to take your case as a personal favor to me." Tyler's eyes widened with something that looked like genuine gratitude, rather than the entitled expectation I'd grown accustomed to over the years. "Dad, I don't know how to thank you," he began, but I held up my hand to stop him before he could continue down a familiar path of emotional manipulation disguised as appreciation. "You don't thank me, Tyler. You use this opportunity to build something better than what you had before, and you never forget what it cost to get here." I stood slowly, my joints protesting after too many hours spent in uncomfortable institutional furniture, and looked at my son through the reinforced plexiglass that had become the symbol of our relationship, close enough to see each other clearly, but separated by barriers that couldn't be crossed with good intentions alone. "Tyler," I said, my voice carrying the weight of 30 years of love, disappointment, hope, and hard-earned wisdom. "You told me to disappear on your birthday. You chose your friends over your family, their approval over my respect, their temporary entertainment over permanent relationships." Tyler's face crumpled as he remembered that night, the watch falling to the floor, the moment when he'd traded his father's love for an audience's applause. "Now I will," I continued, each word carefully chosen and precisely delivered like the final specifications for a construction project that had taken decades to complete. "The only difference is this time I leave you with a chance to change." Tyler's mouth fell open as the implications of my words registered, and I could see him beginning to understand that this conversation was an ending rather than a beginning, a conclusion rather than a reconciliation. "But Dad," he whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "I finally understand what you were trying to teach me, what you've always been trying to show me about real love versus fake friendship." I placed my palm against the plexiglass, and after a moment's hesitation, Tyler pressed his hand against the same spot on his side, creating the illusion of contact across a barrier that might as well have been 1,000 miles wide. "Understanding is the first step, Tyler," I said gently, my voice carrying all the love I'd never been able to make him feel, and all the sorrow of walking away from someone whose life you'd spent 30 years trying to save. But change requires action. Growth requires consequences. And sometimes the people who love you most have to become strangers, so you can learn to value what you had when you had it. Do you think Tyler deserves a second chance? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and thanks for watching.